welcome back to the day 2 of the virtual conferences of the ASEAN International Furniture and Furnishings Show VX. For our second session today, our speaker will give us updates on the Southeast Asian tourism industry. To introduce our speaker, please welcome Mr. Merrill Yu, CEO of YNS 1847.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're very happy to have Hannah Pearson back with us. Hannah is originally from the UK and has moved with her family to Asia using KL as their home and base. And very, very quickly, Hannah has established herself as a key influencer in the field of tourism and hospitality development. She has a much look forward to weekly update on tourism within ASEAN. And I must say that she really is well respected, regarded by anybody that's anybody in the hospitality business. Without much further ado, thank you for joining us and doing this with us, Hannah, and it's to you.
Thank you very much, Mel. Thank you, Meryl, so much. So first of all, before I get started, I will just apologize for the drilling. In typical webinar fashion, they started 5 minutes before this. So let me share my screen and show you what we will get started with then. As Meryl said just now, my name's Hannah. I'm the director of Pear, and Pear are a tourism consultancy firm specializing in Southeast Asia. And every week for the last year, I've been putting together updates on the Southeast Asian industry and basically how COVID-19 has impacted it. And the main message, I guess, that I want to share with you all today is that, borders are shut across Southeast Asia, and they have been shut for almost 1 year now. So that's been a really long time. And what that has meant is that there are really limited opportunities for revenue right now in every country. You've got no international tourists coming in. Outbound travel agents have got no customers going out. And this is a quick overview of everything that's happening in Southeast Asia right now. And so again, I update this on a weekly basis. And you can see, I look at lockdowns, I look at inbound travel restrictions and outbound travel restrictions. No country right now, I would say, in Southeast Asia is kind of free of lockdown. All of them have a lockdown in one way or another. And by lockdown, I kind of class things like schools being closed, or perhaps there's a limitation on the number of people that can gather together. All of these things are still in place. So even in Singapore, where right now they have a very, very low number of cases, there's still that maximum number of people being able to gather together, which is 8 people. That's still really, really small. So yes, schools are open, offices are open, you can go to the restaurants, you can go to the malls, but you still can't gather together with more than 8 friends or family in one place. In terms of inbound travel restrictions, many countries right now have very, very limited opportunities, especially, tourism is pretty much non-existent for inbound. Thailand, I've got a green there and say quarantine, and that's because Thailand is technically open. They do have tourist visas, but there is a really complicated process getting people into the country. You've got to pay lots of money. You've still got to undergo a quarantine. So it is open, but not really open. And in terms of outbound travel, you have countries like Indonesia and even the Philippines, where yes, outbound travel technically for non-essential purposes is permitted, but you still have to undergo a quarantine when you come back. So there's that disincentive to travel. So overall, the picture still, 1 year on, is still a little bit gloomy, I would say. And if we're looking at tourism arrivals, last year, these numbers, I think, come as no surprise to anybody, given that around this time last year, all the borders closed. So what that has meant is we've seen international inbound numbers really fall. So from Thailand, from almost 40 million to 6.7 million. Singapore from almost 20 million to less than 3 million. In Philippines, 1.32 million. And the majority of these arrivals all happened in Q1 last year. So after that, you probably had a period, Q2, Q3, where there were really, really few people coming in. And then international arrivals started to pick up a tiny amount, in that maybe it's in the thousands. And that's where we are really right now, coming into 2021. International arrivals are still extremely low. So what I wanted to do is go through country by country, some of the main markets in Southeast Asia, and talk a little bit about what's going on there, what are the key events, and what might be a potential game changer, to start opening up tourism and start generating more tourism revenue. So in Indonesia, as I just mentioned, outbound tourism, yes, it's permitted, but there's a 5-day quarantine. And actually, this was different. Last year, you could just return back to Indonesia, you could take an RT-PCR test, and if it tested negative, you could go on your way with no quarantine. So you did start to see some outbound travel happening. Indonesians were traveling to Turkey, they were traveling to Dubai. But now the government implemented this 5-day quarantine. We've really seen those numbers fall again. Inbound travel, very limited. It's right now only those people who have travel corridor arrangements, and I'll talk about those in a minute. For domestic tourism, it is permitted, but they have this regulation quite similar to how the Philippines had quite until very recently, where you have to have a test before the flight. And these testing times really vary, depending if you're flying to Bali, depending if you're flying to Java, and it's RT-PCR test, it's expensive. You've then got to coordinate the timing of the tests with, your arrival, your departure times. It's really complicated. It's a massive disincentive for tourists to travel domestically. Overall, in terms of cases, they remain high. They really peaked in January. At one point, they hit about 12 or 13,000 daily new cases in a day. And now that's gone down to levels about 5,000 something. So we have seen a drop there. The health minister has said, is there enough testing going on? And that's perhaps a different question. So yes, cases are dropping. Hopefully that is a good sign. They are still under some kind of form of lockdown. They call it micro PPKM, which is basically you're limiting the number of people who can work from the office. You're limiting shopping mall hours and so on. Schools remain closed. And an interesting move that the government did earlier in the year is they announced that they're going to remove 5 collective leave days from the 2021 calendar. So collective leave days are similar to annual leave, except these tend to be kind of the bridging. So if the annual leave is on a Thursday, maybe a collective leave day would be on a Friday to make it that long weekend. And what Indonesia realized, I think, last year was every time they had one of these long weekends, yes, domestic tourism was stimulated, but at the same time, cases also spiked. So they're trying to really weigh up, I think, that public health risk versus cases spiking and trying to stimulate domestic tourism. Whether it's the right decision, we'll see. But for me, what could be big game changers in Indonesia right now? One exciting idea they're talking about is the COVID-free corridor. And this is the idea of allowing vaccinated travelers in to visit Bali. They would be restricted to kind of green zones. It seems that every week more and more details of this are coming out, but still nothing is firm. There's no start date. Potential source markets could be China. They've talked about Singapore. This morning I saw them talking about Australia, but city specific, so perhaps like Perth. And if that came off, of course, that would be a massive game changer for the inbound industry. And the other game changer potentially is, they call it GNOS testing. So this is a different alternative to the RT-PCR kind of nasal swab, in that it's painless. You just breathe into it. It's very cheap. It's $1.40. Results are out in a few minutes. You don't need specialist equipment. And if this were then implemented for domestic flights, instead of having to have this RT-PCR test, I think that this could be a massive game changer in terms of, you're just removing that inconvenience factor, that cost factor. And if it's really that quick, you could seamlessly kind of insert it into the airport process, arrive at the airport, get your GNOS, then go check in and so on. It could be a lot a lot smoother flow. So I think if this is implemented, that could be a really big incentive for people to travel. Looking at vaccinations, and Indonesia, I think I read this morning, they've now vaccinated, I think at least the first dose, 3 million Indonesians. Obviously, Indonesia's population, I think, is something like 190 million, so they've got a long way to go. But they are rolling it out. They were one of the first countries in ASEAN to start doing this. And they have moved out from phase 1, so they're in phase 2 now. So they're looking at public service, officers, senior tourism, senior citizens, and they're really prioritizing tourism workers, especially in these areas within Bali that they are trying to designate green zones as part of this COVID-free corridor. And phase 3 for the general population should be from maybe July onwards. So we're still a little way away from it being rolled out to everybody, but they are at least starting. And in terms of travel corridors, I mentioned this earlier. So they have a couple already established. They have one with the UAE, they have one with China. These are just for business and official travel purposes. They did have one with Singapore, but that was suspended when Indonesia closed in January to all foreigners. They had one with Japan, but Japan closed its international borders, so Indonesia did the same. And we keep seeing this idea of an ASEAN travel corridor with Indonesia. So Indonesia has proposed this to ASEAN and the ASEAN tourism ministers, and they are leading this task force into looking into an ASEAN travel corridor. Now, I do have my reservations whether that will actually come off, because if you look at ASEAN, you know, we saw right now, everybody is at such different levels of lockdown, different levels of cases, different levels of how you even handle the virus itself, that for me, I think ASEAN being able to establish a common framework to enable travel would be really something quite monumental, something quite difficult. So moving on to Malaysia. So as Meryl said, Malaysia is where I'm based. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia, it's really a mixed picture. So cases have been going down. Again, they really peaked in January. We had quite a hard lockdown here in Kuala Lumpur, the capital, and Selangor, the neighboring state. And just last week, that was eased off a little bit. So we're now under what they call a conditional movement control order until the middle of March. But I think probably the biggest thing for Malaysia really in terms of domestic travel is that interstate travel for the majority is banned. And up till quite recently, for the past couple of months, even inter-district, so going from one district within a state to another, was banned. That was now lifted from last week. But this interstate travel, it still remains an issue. Now, yesterday, the government announced that interstate travel between states which are under recovery movement control order, so that's the most lenient order, is now permitted, but only permitted if you are going in a tour agency vehicle. So basically, you couldn't go on a road trip. And given that a lot of domestic travel in Malaysia happens in private vehicles, it happens with road trips, I think there is a question mark as to how effective this new policy will be. Inbound travel, very, very limited, just to those who are kind of visa holders, but they have announced that business travelers will be allowed in, both on short-term and long-term, and short-term may be able to skip quarantine. But they have to get permissions for that. So it's still not really a free-for-all. Outbound travel is quite limited. Again, Malaysians are not really permitted to do outbound travel for leisure purposes, for example. And this has left the tourism industry really crying out for financial aid. Nearly every week in the papers, there's another article from MATA, which is the Agency for Travel Agencies, or MAH, the Association for Hotels, asking for government financial aid. And there has not really been much support, I would say, that's specifically targeted at the tourism industry. There have been some wage subsidy schemes, but these are generic ones for everybody. But, you know, we'll see. The government has hinted they might give some more financial support soon, so perhaps that might change. The real game changer in Malaysia has to be this lifting of interstate travel restrictions, and in particular those interstate travel restrictions on Kuala Lumpur, on Selangor, because you know these two are two of the biggest states in Malaysia. They account for the largest source market for many, many states across the country. And if you are not permitting these two to go out and travel, then domestic tourism is going to be really hard to revive. Now, of course, Selangor and KL also have the highest number of cases. So you've got that kind of going against them. So interstate travel is only really going to be possible once Malaysia really gets this handle on cases and once we start to see cases really fall. In terms of vaccinations, it started on the 24th of February, so it's been going for just a couple of weeks now, still very much in phase 1. They anticipate general population to be rolled out starting from May, and they have talked about issuing vaccination passports, although right now they have still not kind of confirmed whether if you are vaccinated, you'll be able to skip quarantine. They haven't come out with any policies on that yet, but I would imagine that they will do so quite soon. In terms of travel corridors, they have one with Singapore, which is specifically for those workers. Of course, there are a lot of people who live in Singapore and work in Malaysia, or vice versa, because they share that border there. So they have this periodic commuting arrangement for those kinds of workers. They did have a reciprocal green lane, but Singapore actually suspended that from the 1st of February for 3 months because of the growing number of cases in Malaysia. And they have said that they keep coming out and saying that they are looking at travel bubbles. They're looking at travel bubbles with countries like Brunei. Apparently, they've almost got the reciprocal green lane confirmed with Indonesia, so that's in the process. But the others are still very much a wish list. If you look at some of these countries, names like Australia, New Zealand, to me, they seem pretty unlikely to come off just because Australia and New Zealand pursue this really this policy of eradicating the virus, whereas I think Malaysia is very much in kind of a managing the virus, and they're just not really compatible for travel bubbles. Having a look at the Philippines now. So I guess a lot of you are based in the Philippines, so you probably know this as well as I do. But Philippines, it's complicated. That's what I always say when people ask me about what's happening in the Philippines. It's very complicated. Domestic tourism, it is permitted. It's permitted for certain provinces. It's permitted in certain local government units, LGUs, but it's subject to lots and lots of different requirements, lots of different restrictions. I mean, the one positive move that happened last week was that the IATF, so the task force for COVID, removed this obligation for travelers to have an RT-PCR test before flying. They removed this restriction of having to get a travel authority, but it is still down to that LGU to decide whether to implement that or not. And so, of course, the aim is great to harmonize this, to make it a lot easier for the general public to be able to travel. The reality is that this is still completely different. So you had Cebu province come out and say that they're removing all of these restrictions. Anybody can visit, but if you're going to Cebu City, you still need a test. Lapu-Lapu City, you don't. So there's this really strange kind of relationship, I guess, between that. And this doesn't help domestic tourism at all. It is incredibly confusing. It's quite costly to have these tests too. And like Indonesia, you know, it's that timing. It's trying to coordinate everything that makes it really difficult. Inbound tourism, pretty much non-existent. Again, just mainly for visa holders, for balikbayan. Outbound tourism, like I mentioned earlier, it is permitted, but you still have to undergo this quarantine on return. So it's a big disincentive to do travel. We've seen over the past couple of weeks in terms of cases that cases are starting to increase again in Metro Manila. Again, there was a little peak in January and it started to go down, and now it's just started to go back up again, which is a little worrying. Metro Manila itself still remains under general community quarantine, GCQ. Right, much of the rest of the company is under MGCQ. And we're starting to see more domestic attractions being allowed to open, even under GCQ areas, MICE being permitted as well. Staycations are permitted in certain hotels in GCQ areas. So there is some baby steps, but I'd say that Philippines is far, far from being an open country for domestic tourism. And in fact, I saw that the DOT actually came out this week and she said that she hoped that by the end of this year, all areas that are under MGCQ in the Philippines would be open for tourism. So just that is the aim, that the whole country would be open for domestic tourism by the end of the year. To me, signals a little bit that the Philippines is going to be only about domestic travel this year. I see international travel, especially inbound, being a really, really slim possibility, given that that's how the Department of Tourism itself is looking at just domestic tourism for this year. The Philippines also went a very similar way to Indonesia, in that they have removed some annual leave days from the 2021 calendar. I think Duterte said because they need to work for the economy. Again, a couple of these, particularly I think Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, would create long weekends. So this is taking away from that possibility of, more domestic tourism being generated. But what are the game changers really here? I said potential game changer, and it's this, the removal of this compulsory testing. And hopefully more provinces, more LGUs will start to follow Cebu province's example now and start to remove those, and we will slowly start to see more people returning to travel in the Philippines. In terms of vaccinations, it just started, didn't it? It just rolled out about a week ago. It's still a pretty slow rollout. Again, it's a bit of a confusing rollout. General population Q3 onwards. Let's see if that happens. And in terms of travel corridors negotiated, none. Like I said, I very much feel that Philippines' focus right now is just sorting itself out domestically, and then it will look at opening internationally. Having a look at Singapore now. So, I mean, you could say that Singapore is one of the countries that has really handled COVID very, very well. Like I said, right now, in terms of locally transmitted cases, they just have 1 or 2 here and there. They can really trace them. They really know where they've come from. Domestic tourism is permitted, but of course it's limited. You're on a very, very small island. What can you do? I mean, you have got some very creative, very innovative ideas around in the industry, but you've still got that limitation there. In terms of inbound tourism, I'll show you with the travel corridors in a minute. They do permit some countries in, even without quarantine, but this is generated very, very limited numbers. And outbound tourism, the same. Singaporeans are permitted to go to these countries and won't have to quarantine on return, but those countries don't allow the citizens in. So it's kind of opening, but not fully. I mentioned earlier, lockdown still very much in place in terms of limitations in number of gathering together. And for MICE, it's permitted, it's up to 250 packs, and they have actually scored a really big event this year. They have managed to be allowed to host the World Economic Forum, which is normally held in Davos in Switzerland, to be held in Singapore in August, which they're really hoping, I think, will signal that Singapore can handle these kind of international events, and hopefully without any issues. They are consistently trying to find new ways to open up. They have so many different schemes that they are looking into, and the government know that this is in their best interest. Singapore is set up as a hub. Changi Airport in particular is, it's a transit airport, it's a hub airport. And Singapore kind of know that without this status as an international hub, they will lose something. For the country, they will lose a significant part of the economy. So for them, it is very much in their best interest to try to open up. But, it's a lot smaller. It's much easier to control those borders when you're a small country than it is a massive one like the Philippines or Indonesia. And one potential game changer that could come into play soon, and almost came into play last year, is this air travel bubble. So this is an idea of a leisure travel bubble, and it was going to be set up between Singapore and Hong Kong last November. It was then cancelled at the last minute because Hong Kong's cases started to rise. But, Hong Kong's cases have started to fall now. So both governments have come out in the press and say that they are looking into doing this again. And this could be a game changer simply because there are still not that many leisure travel bubbles in the world right now. And even especially in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. So if Singapore does manage to open this and does manage to, to make it come off, it could be a really interesting model for how other countries could handle this later on. And Singapore have said that they are, going to keep pursuing travel bubbles, and they will pursue this when the time is right. In terms of vaccinations, they're in phase 2 right now. Phase 3 with the general population is meant to happen in April, but they're actually speeding things up. They are getting through a lot of their senior citizens. They're now calling up teachers to be vaccinated too. So things are moving a little bit faster. And I think that's probably to do with the supply of vaccines, which is what was limiting it before. And I think that they've now got more vaccines, so they're able to speed up the process a little bit. And in terms of all of these different travel arrangements and things, this is what it is. And it's pretty confusing. They've got lots of different ways of doing things. And I think I've even missed out the, they call it travel pass agreements, which is basically those countries that don't have to quarantine on their way back. So for example, Brunei, China, Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand don't have to quarantine when they come back to Singapore because they have those cases under control. They also have reciprocal green lanes with Brunei, with China, like I said, this one with Malaysia. They have Connected Singapore, which is this idea of business travelers being able to fly in from anywhere, but they have to stay. It's almost kind of airside. It's this dedicated facility that they've set up. Business travelers stay in there and they're not allowed to mingle around. You're not allowed to go out into Singapore. You have to stay in this facility. But it's to really enable those business negotiations that have to be done face to face. So they've set up these special meeting rooms with like plexiglass between the incoming people and the Singaporeans so that they can do tests. They've got a little hatch that you can sterilize the documents before passing to one another for the signing. It's pretty high tech, but it's not going to generate a lot of inbound tourists. And like I said, they have a lot of suspended reciprocal green lanes as well. And these were suspended because cases were starting to rise in those countries. Moving on to Thailand, which has always got something going on. So for Thailand, domestic tourism is permitted. They've just gone through this kind of second wave of cases, which started in December or so. That's really tailed off now. So now we're seeing more and more provinces opening up to one another, whereas before there were perhaps even quarantines on interprovincial travel. Inbound tourism, like I said, is kind of permitted, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but with lots of quarantines and lots of requirements. Outbound tourism, very much discouraged. Lockdown, most things are back open across the country. There's just one province, Samut Sakhon, which is just south of Bangkok, which is still struggling to contain the cases. Cases are still high there. But other than that, things are slowly getting back to normal in Thailand. Now, Thailand have done the opposite of Philippines and Indonesia. They've actually added public holidays to the calendar this year to stimulate domestic tourism. One of the ones they added was Chinese New Year. That's not normally a public holiday. It was this year. Unfortunately, they were in the middle of this surge of cases, so they didn't really see any results from that. But they do have some more scheduled that are coming. In terms of domestic, the aviation, it's interesting because the flights were recovering there. I mean, Thailand, especially the aviation, has always been asking for soft loans. The airlines there have been lobbying the government since I think July last year, asking for more help, which has not been given yet. But Thai Air Asia Q4 results, they actually said exceeded expectations. So recovery was very much there in December. It then dropped because of this second wave. But they've got a lot of potential game changers on the horizon. So one is this idea of an area hotel quarantine. And this would be allowing travelers to self-isolate in their hotel rooms for 3 days, be tested, and then if they test negative, they'd be allowed to use the resort or the hotel facilities, which is a lot more of an incentive than having to stay in your room for 14 days, particularly if it's a nice resort. Some long-haul travelers just go to Thailand to stay in resorts. So potentially they may see more tourists from that. And this other idea of quarantine-free entry for vaccinated travelers. And actually this week, the tourism and health ministers have come out and this proposal has not yet been officially approved. Right? It's not in law yet, but it's pretty much saying that if you are vaccinated, travelers will be able to cut quarantine from 14 days till 7 days. And if you are not vaccinated, you'll be able to cut your quarantine until 10 days. And again, this could be another game changer. This could be something that can help stimulate tourism. In terms of the vaccination, it's really slow, actually, Thailand. And a lot of that is to do with they are going to be producing the AstraZeneca vaccine in Thailand itself. And most of that production isn't really getting into progress until May. So they're very much relying on this AstraZeneca vaccine. But they are going to be prioritizing tourism workers. They're going to be prioritizing tourism workers, particularly in these area quarantine hotels. Places like in Phuket, in Koh Samui and Pattaya, for example, they're really tourist hotspots to help protect them there. And these are some of the current entry types that Thailand has. It has plenty of different ways to get in. None of them are cheap, none of them are easy. So you've got the special tourist visa. So that was introduced last October. A really big fanfare, but has generated maybe 3,000 tourists per month. Still has a 14-day quarantine. Visa on arrival, which is actually for 56 countries. You still need to do a quarantine, and you still have to even get a certificate of entry from the embassy. So it's not really that you can just arrive into Thailand without booking anything. This concept of the villa quarantine that we just talked about, the area hotel quarantine, and even a golf quarantine. And so a golf quarantine is very similar to the area hotel quarantine. You think you have to self-isolate for a few days, and then you are free to go and use the golf course, but it's very much limited to low-risk countries. And moving on to the last country then, Vietnam. So Vietnam is one of these countries that last year was doing really, really well for domestic tourism. In terms of air capacity, it was almost back for domestic at pre-COVID levels. And some airlines like Bamboo Airways, Vietjet Air actually made profit last year. And I think they are some of the few airlines in the world to have made profit in such a terrible year last year. Now, Vietnam also had a third wave really in January. And this was kind of disastrous timing for Vietnam because it was Tet, the Lunar New Year, coming up at the end of January. So all of those expectations, and there were really high expectations for domestic tourism in Vietnam, were kind of smashed with that. And there was some travel still, but not as extensive, not as prolific as was originally hoped. In terms of lockdowns now, a lot of the country is slowly going back to normal. Most schools have reopened. There's just 1 or 2 areas which are still under, they call social distancing orders, which is essentially a lockdown. So it is getting back under control. But a real game changer that has to be there for Vietnam is they have to start allowing more inbound flights. Right now, they have extremely limited inbound flights into the country. And they really don't have many travel agreements either. They have something with Laos, but that's it. For them to really kickstart, especially international tourism, there needs to be a lot more effort that goes in there. But Vietnam have the luxury of having a very big domestic market. They have the luxury of having a very diverse domestic product as well. So you could argue that perhaps maybe they need domestic tourism less than other countries. And this is their vaccination rollout. It's a very detailed one compared to some of the other countries. But you can see general population not until the very end of this year, maybe the beginning of next year. So this is still a way away. Luckily, tourism workers are there. They're in phase 4, Q3. But perhaps this is a more realistic timeline than some of the others. But things will be slowly rolled out here, I think, in Vietnam. And they did have some travel corridors I mentioned with Laos, with Japan, but these have been suspended. So having a quick look at some future trends, and of course, nobody has a crystal ball, right? But there have been some interesting surveys, consumer surveys that have been coming out from various people. So one that I really like, this is the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute, who asked ASEAN tourists what country is their favorite holiday destination. And across all ASEAN countries, Japan is the number one, right? 30.2%. Europe, 23.3% was saying they would go there. The ASEAN members, about 12.2%. So even though Japan is, still struggling with COVID, it is still up there, it's still at the top. In terms of ASEAN destinations itself, this is pretty interesting. So Thailand wins out. And Thailand is always such a popular destination for ASEAN anyhow. And I imagine that with its pretty good response to COVID, it's got incredibly low death rate, still very low number of cases, really. It's an attractive destination. Followed by Singapore, I would imagine the same. It's had a really robust kind of COVID reaction. And Vietnam. So 16.6. But countries like Malaysia, you can see just 6.6%. That's pretty low for Malaysia. Philippines 2.5%. So it's hard to know whether that's down to COVID response and cases or what that's down to, but looks like Thailand is going to be a winner. Expedia did this study, the vacation deprivation study. So basically they asked people how vacation deprived they feel. The interesting thing here is Singaporeans feel really vacation deprived. So last year was 71%, the year before was 67%. So that has really increased. It seems to be increasing every year actually anyhow. So you could argue that that kind of signals there is this pent up demand for Singaporeans to do outbound travel. Whereas countries like Malaysia, it's actually a little bit less than last year. Thailand, also a lot less than last year. So perhaps these countries will not be doing so much outbound travel when it is permitted. And just a few of the key stats from Singapore, which they released, that basically show that Singaporeans are expecting to spend more money this year. So they're looking to book, they're waiting to book until H2. They need flexibility. But 62% expect to spend more on their bucket list vacation than originally planned. 67% say their budget has increased. And they're looking at countries like Hong Kong. I guess that's triggered by the air travel bubble last year. Bangkok, Tokyo, we were just seeing Japan, right? Maldives. Maldives is open, so I presume that's why. Countries and cities in China, Bali, London, Ho Chi Minh City. So these potentially are going to see some serious Singaporean spend when Singaporeans are permitted to travel outbound again. And for Agoda, they released a what matters most, and this is what people are most looking forward to for travel in 2021. For the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia, it's spending more quality time with loved ones, so taking those kind of family vacations. Singaporeans being able to travel unhindered, we've talked about it, they're kind of trapped in Singapore, so they're looking to get out. And for Indonesia and Vietnam, it's interesting that doing things that matter or make a difference, so that kind of socially responsible travel has quite an input, will have a role into how they choose to travel this year as well. So I think that's always interesting for markets to consider when they're planning their travel products. So that was a really brief overview of what's going on in Southeast Asia in terms of tourism right now. Obviously, there's plenty more. As I mentioned, I release a weekly report. It comes out every Sunday. So if you go to pearanderson.com/coronavirus, there's a link to sign up there. I've also got a live dashboard. It's constantly updated with news stories. So you can catch more information about what's going on in Southeast Asia there. And hopefully some people have got some questions to ask now.
Thank you for sharing those updates, Ms. Hannah. Before we proceed to the Q&A, here are the house rules. Please turn off your video and set your audio to mute. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You may ask your questions using the chat box. It's possible that not all questions will be answered live, but we can email the list of questions and answers to all attendees after the webinar. Ms. Hannah, you may now answer the questions of our attendees.
Hi, Hannah.
Hey.
I guess a question I had was, on the Mother Goose rhyme, good, better, best, never rest till the good be better and better best, right? Who would you give the kudos award in terms of tourism and country synergies to for last year? Which of those countries? And why? And why?
And why? The why is always the more interesting part, right? I think in terms of really trying to support the tourism industry, Singapore has to be up there. I mean, they have that unfair advantage because they have the money, right? And I think that's what a lot of they have stepped up and they've done wage subsidies, and they have come out with their Singapore Rediscovers campaign, which basically gave 100 Sing dollar vouchers to all Singaporeans to spend at tour operators and hotels. They've really supported the aviation industry, and they've given like upskilling, reskilling programs to people in the tourism industry so that they can do that whilst they're kind of waiting for things to recover. I mean, I think where they fall down is still, if you were an outbound travel agent in Singapore, you had still had no business for a year, right? And there's very little support for you really. But in terms of the general trying to support the ecosystem and recognizing that they have to reopen is Singapore.
Okay. In terms of population scale, Philippines is always sort of up there with Thailand. How would you, I guess, with the benefit of hindsight, 2020 being hindsight, how would you contrast the two countries?
That's an interesting one. I think the main difference has to be between Thailand and the Philippines is just this devolved power, I think, to the Philippines and these local government units, right? These LGUs who have chosen or not to reopen their destination. And I think at that level, of course, it's great because it means they know what's going on in the ground. They can make a decision that's right for them. But I think that it has held back domestic tourism because there's then that limit, right? And it gets very confusing for travelers. In the Philippines, you don't know where you can travel, where you can't, download this app, have this test, get a travel authority. Whereas in Thailand, there hasn't been that much kind of devolved. Yes, some provinces now and then have had quarantine restrictions on one another, during kind of surges. But largely things have been open. But I guess that also comes down to the cases, right? So Philippines has pretty much been in the first wave of cases since last March.
Yeah.
Whereas Thailand had this initial first wave, probably from about June onwards, had very, very few till the end of this year when they were unlucky enough to get hit. So there's that to factor into.
The I guess current reports from the Maldives are very positive in terms of arrivals. I think something like 90,000 or something like that. For countries like Philippines, Indonesia that are more island-based for resorts, say like here would be Boracay, Indonesia would be Bali, Langkawi, right? Whatever. Let's just say Bali. What would you think of the idea of inoculating, say, an island where everybody, because islands are fairly small and the working population is likewise. If everybody got inoculated, in essence, declaring that this island is basically COVID-free, right? Would that be a possible direction in terms of the countries being, one of those, the tail wags the dog, right? That if you make your little, your signature island safe, would it bring in more business? What do you think of that?
I think it potentially could for those really small islands where it's kind of a one resort, one island type destination. So like in Indonesia, like Bintan or Batam, they have these kind of, in the Riau Islands, they have these very small ones. And a lot of Singaporeans go there. So you could essentially, vaccinate everyone there. And it's also almost with the understanding that domestic tourists won't travel there, because that's also where the problem comes in. Because of course, the Maldives, it doesn't have so much domestic tourism. You don't have that mingling of international and local tourists, at least on these resort islands. Like the workers there are, the locals there are the resort workers, basically. So it could work to a certain extent, but if you was, let's say Bali, and this is their idea, to vaccinate certain areas of Bali so that you can then reopen it. I think where it gets really tricky is then you then have Indonesians coming in from other destinations, of course, but perhaps they're not vaccinated. And then that brings risk. And it's actually a disincentive for both sides, right? Because perhaps domestic Indonesian travelers don't want to travel to a destination where international travelers are coming in, and international travelers might not want to go to a destination where unvaccinated locals could come into.
True.
It's hard.
Yeah. I guess you would have to make as a country a decision or tourism as to, are you going for volume or are you going for niche markets? For say, if you're going for the A market, they're obviously, they want to get out, they have the resources, but they don't want to mingle with a general tourism population, right? So I guess it would have to be a decision made by, I guess, the LGU, tourism, whatever, to move in a particular direction. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think is, you alluded to it in your presentation in terms of the vaccine rollouts, and that Vietnam, I think, had the most realistic one. In fact, looking at their model, I think, well, that's certainly more detail oriented and to a degree, almost like for the common person, more realistic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say, what's your prognosis for 2021? Is this really just going to be a same as 2020 with a progression of getting into vaccine? Or I mean, how would you?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say it's going to be a complete game changer, and by the end of this year, we're going to be back to where we were in 2019. But I think that's just not realistic. I think it is going to be a slow progression, and I think that vaccination has to go hand in hand with really robust testing. And I think we will see some countries start to change these requirements. Like even, as I mentioned earlier, Thailand is starting to change this requirement for vaccinated travelers, but they're still not getting rid of the quarantine altogether. Now they just have to quarantine for 7 days, not 14 days. So we might see this gradual shortening until I think it's more proven that these vaccines will stop transmission, and that's what they're really most worried about. I think is still that transmission.
Okay. What was interesting when you mentioned Indonesia, the genos, that seems like really a game changer, not only for Indonesia, but literally any country within ASEAN.
Yeah.
Where do you see that development?
Well, I mean, sometimes why I'm a bit more puzzled that governments aren't spending a bit more time, or perhaps they are, but they're not talking about it, about developing these things. Like in the Philippines, you've got the saliva RT-PCR testing as well, right? Which is, again, is a bit cheaper. It's less uncomfortable. And I think that's where things have to go. That's why I'm saying kind of testing has to go hand in hand with the vaccination. But testing also has to become cheaper. It has to become faster. It has to become, I think a lot of people, even me, I don't like the thought of having to go and have something shoved really far up my nose. If it's just, it's spit into something, you think, okay, fine, that I can handle that.
That's
So,
true.
yeah.
There was a question, and I'll rephrase it, I guess. Fearless forecast, where are we 6 months from now, 12 months from now, local tourism by country? I would probably rephrase that by saying, of all the countries you mentioned, who do you think will make the most significant growth by the end of this year? And then I would say the second part would be, of the countries that don't make any significant jumps this year, who do you see will make it, say, January to June next year? So within a 12-month crystal ball, I guess, for lack of a better word. So what do you think? So who would so by December this year, who would we give our kudos to?
By December, the end of this year, it might be Indonesia. I feel like they keep coming out, they keep talking about this COVID-free corridor. They might just manage to get it up and running. But of course, that might be hampered by a slow vaccine rollout. Of course, this is going to be really complicated in Indonesia. So Indonesia, perhaps that might be one. Thailand could be one. I mean, Thailand certainly have a lot of ideas. It's often when it comes into the implementation, things get a bit messy. But Thailand certainly has motivation. So much of their GDP is reliant on tourism. So many tourism workers unemployed that they really have. So that might just be like the motivation that they need.
Interesting you said that Thailand, AstraZeneca is producing it in Thailand. You would think that, well, you're in our country, they would get first dibs on access to not only the vaccine, but the volume required, right? Do you see that as as you know, my wife's family is from Malaysia as well, and this whole issue of vaccine availability and the rollout, there's no definite rollout timelines on when it's going to come out. So okay, so prognosis would probably be Thailand. Okay, in terms of countries of size, right? Because Singapore, you would expect them to do well because one, it's Singapore, two, they're a bit smaller, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just easier for them to control things. When you're that small, you can control it. When it gets big countries, multiple land borders, that's when it gets complicated.
I guess some of the countries that weren't covered, where do you look at, say, Taiwan, South Korea, for, people that are cooped up? Taiwan is about, it's 20 million people, but they're about an island and they're basically stuck within that island, right? Where do you see their impact in terms of the northern Asian countries, South Korea, China, um, uh, and those guys.
I mean, I don't track, what's going on kind of domestically in inbound too much, but I think in terms of outbound markets, these are going to be really big outbound markets once they first start happening. And of course, the big one everybody wants is China, right? Everybody, I think, in Southeast Asia is waiting for Chinese outbound travelers to be allowed back out. And it's almost going to be a race, I think, amongst Southeast Asian travelers as to who gets that first taste of them, because whoever does is going to make the most money, is going to succeed, I think.
So it'll be the chase for the Chinese market.
I think so.
Okay, interesting. Okay, cool. Let's see what other questions. I guess we've covered the ASEAN countries copycat. Yeah. I think. Okay, and best practice. I think we've covered that. Okay. Okay, but it'd be interesting. I mean, it's almost it basically is the end of the first quarter. It's almost like when we blinked, it was sort of pre-Christmas, and then when you blink again, it's first quarter. So, to a degree, the earlier food and beverage panel, they're based. I think the general feeling is that where we are now will basically be the same for the balance of the year, without anything really being a game changer, right? And I guess from your own presentations and your own insights, yeah. So this year really is another early transition per se, right, into vaccine.
Yeah, I think hopefully, Q4 we will finally start to see things really picking up. But I think that this idea of, all by mid-year, so many millions around the world are going to be vaccinated and able to travel is that might be true, but it's still not going to mean that they are going to be able to travel and they're going to be let in. Yeah.
I think what's interesting in your insights is that if you take a look at the larger land masses within countries, so you take Thailand, which is basically one big landmass, and you take Indonesia, which is Java, per se, Kalimantan. I take the Philippines, which is Luzon. It's also been mentioned by you that what's holding it back for domestic tourism is these literally cross-state requirements, right? So I think it would be incumbent on the combination of federal and local government to make a decision as to how to drive it, because how many countries in Asia would love to have population base, one island, you could travel by road, right? And yet our geographical advantages seem to be outweighed or offset by quasi-political correctness and decisions, right? And nobody's followed any one particular model.
No. I mean, every country in ASEAN, I think, is handling it in a completely different way in terms of lockdowns, how you open the country, who you let out. It's difficult, very difficult to keep on top of.
Okay. So let's see. So I guess this year would be it'd be safe to say that tourism is all going to be driven 99% by domestic.
Yeah. I think so. And just the challenge right now is getting domestic open to everybody again. So at least you don't have that restriction holding it back, and it's not going to reach its full potential until everyone can go anywhere within that country.
Well, and on that note, Hannah, thank you very, very much for your wisdom, insight, and for our attendees. Subscribe to Hannah's weekly reports. They tell you everything you want in one beautiful executive summary with insight. So if you want to know what's happening, it's a required reading, right? So thank you very much, Hannah. Right.
Thank you, Mero. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Okay.
And that ends our Q&A portion. Thank you everyone, and we hope you will join us again later at 1 p.m. for our next webinar about the digital manufacturing through FITA.
you.